All right, hello everybody, and this is the second session of the Unordinary Bible study. I did the first session last month. It's October 10th, and last time we as I did when I started the session, I'm gonna kind of reintroduce the whole for those of you who haven't watched the first session. I'll go right into the motivations behind these Bible studies because I'm imagining a number of people watching have been to a Bible study before, or they had some conversation with me in person, and I convinced them to watch this recording later, or we might see some people joining in on the conversation at a later point. But we're not holding this session over Zoom tonight. We're holding it over Discord. And so first off, I want to go over how we're going to conduct this session similar to how we conducted last session. So I want to go into the motivations on the motivation behind why I decided to start hosting these once a month virtual Bible study sessions, which is a partnership. This is a partnership project that I started with the nonprofit organization I'm involved in, known as the Active Inference Institute. So the Active Inference Institute investigates a lot of areas that are of particular interest in machine learning and artificial intelligence research, most especially in understanding human behavior by looking at the scope of perception, how we perceive the world, like the dynamics of how we are perceiving the world around us, how we act upon the world around us, and how we keep track of that history, or the priors, what we call priors, the history of perceiving and responding to how we interact with the world around us and make decisions most effectively at different time scales. And what I mean by different time scales is maybe certain decisions are impactful a little bit later over time, as opposed to more so in the short term, and especially in real time when we make perceptions like observations of the world around us, and we have to act on the world around us in a particular way. And through this dynamic, we're concerned about our fitness. So in a more rudimentary first principle sense, fitness has much to do with how we as organisms are striving to survive as we're exploring the world around us, and of course, in the most primitive sense, reproduction is of utmost value to organisms to persist their fitness and leverage generations of more species of what we call agents, not just organisms, but in the cognitive science arena, what we call organisms, we kind of reframe to be called as agents. Give me 1 second, I gotta close my door. Should have done that at the beginning. I apologize for interrupting my little introduction there. So active inference has, in principle, is focused around how we perceive, act upon the world around us, and how we keep track of this dynamic of perceiving and acting, and how that impacts our decision-making faculties over time, and making sense, building a model of the world around us, and trying to make sense of how things unravel over time, how our actions on the world around us, and the way we think may have consequences, and there could be costs for how we choose to act and perceive the world around us, and especially engaging with other agents, other people, more straightforwardly, especially how we coordinate with each other, and in particular connecting this framework of active inference with what it means to have faith. And I think a lot of that has to do with recognizing our place within the world around us, and then that level of awareness and having that appreciation for others that exist within the world around us, other people, which of course again we consider to be agents within the interacting ecosystem that we co-inhabit. So we co-inhabit this ecosystem that we all exist in, so we're existentially bound to this ecosystem, right? Because as agents we want to persist our fitness, and faith has much to do with wrestling with the uncertainties of that persisting fitness, and how with the awareness we have about the world around us, and how we conduct ourselves, our awareness of our own decision-making faculties, and how the way we perceive and act and learn, our capacity to learn and adapt circumstances is underpinned by the way we model the world around us, the way we model consequences for the actions and the perceptions we choose to endure, and how we engage with others. So on the one hand, we can be uncertain about how we ought to conduct ourselves, and that can have an impact on our mindset in terms of how we optimize decisions and leverage fitness in terms of the outcomes we might expect. So like we have this model, and we're trying of reality, and this model involves predicting and generalizing the best course of action, not just at any given moment per se, but in terms of the short term and the long term dynamics of how things unravel, and how we leverage these decision-making dynamics as agents. And then and so there's a lot of uncertainty that can impact that in terms of on the one hand, how we're leveraging the resources that are accessible to us. On the other hand, how we're interacting with others, and being mindful that we're co-inhabiting a whole ecosystem, and it's not just we humans that exist as agents, but there are other organisms that are agents, that aren't just humans, that serve a role in the ecosystem. And we'll get more into about different roles that different agents play in the ecosystem, and looking into another framework of interest that might be compelling to consider as we get into more generally. We're going to try and focus on talking about the anthropic principle and the holographic principle. I wanted to try and get more deep into the perspective of how faith may be inspiring and insightful in terms of how we can leverage transdisciplinary thinking. So like, okay, how can we take our understanding of faith or motivation of biblical scripture, especially, and how that inspires how we think about, and in terms of understanding the phenomenal aspects of the world around us. Whether we're thinking about reality encompassing the universe and our interactions within it and our own existence. And there might be interesting ways we can try and consider what are the limitations of assessing that. But I'm going to approach it from what I consider the teleological point of view, which brings interest into investigating the anthropic principle in the first place, which also considers the abiogenesis problem. So, anyway, getting ahead of myself here, I brought up what active inference is all about and how it can be of interest for understanding what faith means, and especially for those wrestling with their faith and they want a stronger interpretation of reality around them as they're wrestling with uncertainty of the world and trying to cope with their existence and how they make decisions which can be very helpful to leverage the framework of active inference. But in terms of process theory, I haven't explained process theory at this point, but I did explain it in the first session, but just to elaborate on the significance of process theory, we consider the mechanisms of how interactions happen, not just modeling them. There is a difference between having a model of what's happening as opposed to what's actually happening, where we develop a model to try to simplify or generalize some behavior and how that can some phenomenal aspect of the world, that like some of our ecosystem, or how we leverage certain resources and tools, these models can be useful. But what we mean, what differs between the model and the process is that the model is just it is a way for us to generalize and have an expectation of what kind of interaction is occurring in a certain context, right? So if I have a ball rolling, a boulder rolling down a hill, right? If I imagine a boulder rolling down a hill, well, I'm envisioning what I would consider a model where I have the hill, I have the boulder, and then the boulder rolls down the hill, but then there's the actualization of the boulder rolling down the hill, which is not the model of the boulder rolling down the hill per se, but it's the actual boulder rolling down the hill. So that's the differentiation here between the model and the process. So active inference considers all these intricacies of how we perceive and act and develop expectations to make decisions about how we as agents interact with the world around us and sustain our fitness. That's the main interest of active inference, but we can extend what active inference in a deep sense really means for other interactions happening when we try and understand behaviors of particle collisions or the boulder rolling down the hill in real time, and all these different dynamics that we consider. Instead of having an overly simplistic model of the boulder rolling down the hill, we could really think about different contexts to consider the boulder rolling down the hill, whether if it's like what kind of hill, what does the hill actually look like? Are there bumps in the hill? Not just thinking about an overly generalized boulder rolling down the hill, where we think of like a triangular ramp, right? You have like a 3D model rendering of a boulder as a sphere rolling down a triangular ramp. That's not the actual thing. But anyway, so what also makes what is also interesting about when we consider active inference and process theory with examining what it means to have faith is not just dealing with aspects of uncertainty, but also dealing with how we relate to the world around us, how we can meaningfully connect with the ecosystem, if you will, how we develop these meaningful relationships with other agents in this ecosystem, other people, other animals that aren't, like we consider animals as agents as well, because they're alive and they're life. Like how do we consider how we meaningfully interact with everything in the ecosystem, and what I would like, I would in the best case scenario, and what I hope to be the actual outcome would be in a symbiotic fashion where because we as humans we have this level of agency where we recognize that what role other agents serve in the ecosystem as opposed to us, and recognizing our capacity to contemplate, and how these metacognitive interactions, these self-recognizing, self-reflecting capacities, and self-criticizing, and I don't like to use the word self-correcting per se, but you see where I'm going with this idea of, and it's not that just we as humans are the only species out there, or 8 types of agents that are capable of metacognitive capacities, but I could go on a whole tangent about that per se, but I think that if we think about, relating back to biblical scripture, how mankind serves the role as stewards of the earth, and we're seeing now how that correlates pretty well from the biological narrative, like consider the evolutionary biology narrative of like human behavior, and how, and the capacities of humans compared to other organisms, especially other agents with similar physiology. Although unfortunately, their language is pretty interesting, but we're not going to get into that. So we went over active inference. But how long? It's been 20 minutes. Wow, I've been running my mouth for 20 minutes. Okay, so I went over active inference and process theory. I think I kind of maybe overextended some talking points to introduce motivation here for where we're going with these sessions. Now, I wanted to introduce the. We'll start with the anthropic principle, and we'll consider the holographic principle a little later. I think the holographic principle might be a little bit complicated to get into and relate back to the biblical to the biblical scripture dynamic at play here. But so with the anthropic principle, much like more or less abiogenesis is like, okay, life exists within the universe, which seems quite phenomenal and bewildering. That's a tongue twister. Bewildering. And it's still a mystery as to how life emerged into the universe. But and a lot of interesting postulations have been made upon this. Lee Cronin made this interesting poetic remark about how the universe, life is the universe storing a memory of itself, developing the capacity to store memory of itself. So Lee Cronin says this, right? So for those of you who know who aren't aware of who Lee Cronin is, he's a theoretical chemist that came up with this framework to take molecular compositions and try and figure out, okay, is there a way we can find patterns that lead to the molecular signature, the molecular composition of matter that gives way to life itself? Because the life, if we consider a life molecule per se, we think about DNA or RNA, right? Like this complex molecule that is made up of these pairings of amino acids. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of DNA and all that, but it's quite interesting how when we consider how the anthropic principle really considers here now, okay, well, this phenomena, like there's the fact that there's a chance that life happens, means that the universe exhibits a number of possible ways in which life could have happened, and the fact that life happened in the first place, the fact that life happened in the first place is I guess I lost words for what I was going to say about. Okay, well, life occurred in the universe. Therefore, the universe, at some point, enabled the possibility for life to happen. Because life happened, there could have been a number of scenarios in which interactions perhaps played out within the universe as we know it, where maybe life may have never happened, but somehow a number of billions of years ago, as we're aware, life happened. It just happened on Earth, starting from single cell organisms to then eventually multicellular organisms. And it's just quite fascinating how how agents, if we consider, when we consider organisms themselves as agents, like how agents can coordinate together to sustain themselves and to try to persist their existence, and how this symbiotic capacity of things within the universe, these agents, to be aware of themselves and to we humans as agents, to just for multicellular life to evolve to the point where it develops this level of awareness is quite interesting. So anyway, but before I start looking at some connecting scripture back to the anthropic principle, because of course there's a number of points that can be made from analyzing remarks made about Genesis. There's a number of other things we can say where we can even go back to talking about what it means to have a conscience, not just the capacity of life to happen in the universe, but the fact that life happens and develops this conscience, right? That life has the capacity to develop this capacity of developing conscience, where we have this level of awareness of like how we can recognize ourselves and coordinate ourselves within the ecosystem we are existentially bound to in relation to other organisms, right, or other agents, if you will. And I like to look at this as the ethical policy mitigation capacities of agents, and the ethical policy capacity. And this is where I know I've been going on for about a little over 26 minutes here. God to me, and faith is quite complicated, so I have a lot to say. But this capacity of, in the most simplistic manner, I would say, this potential for goodness among how agents, all the possible ways in which agents can cooperate with each other in a symbiotic manner. And when we consider goodness, we're considering this alignment of this conscience based. I don't want to just say conscious, because conscious also means like, how we feel about our experiences, but it's not just about how we feel about our experiences, but the intentionality of we as agents, as these, in a poetic sense, in a cheesy poetic sense, you could say these beings capable of recognizing the capacity and consequences of decisions and being able to coordinate this capacity. So what I would say is that the capacity to optimize this and symbiotically in the most optimal sense, which would be contextually, this can vary circumstantially and contextually based on how, the environment that all agents are, like the resource, the way that all agents can collectively leverage resources together, like when we consider human civilization, when we consider groups of humans, groups of agents, like coordinating with each other in a collectively a symbiotic fashion, not just in relation to each other, but also being as optimally mindful as possible with how they relate those decision-making faculties with other agents that co-inhabit the ecosystem around them, and how they leverage resources and how they communicate amongst agents related to them, right? So I went over a lot there, but so like this ethical policy alignment, right? It's so this capacity of goodness is basically this ethical policy alignment dynamic that considers the most optimal capacity for agents to symbiotically align their intentions with each other. And hopefully that alignment has to do with, okay, I'm going to try and help you sustain yourself as an agent, because that helps, if I help, it's in the game theoretic sense, it's a tit for tat situation, but tit for tat, as game theory has certainly demonstrated that the tit for tat, as simple as that sounds, like tit for tat really does matter when it comes to how we coordinate with each other. But anyway, I kind of went on for about 30 minutes. I want to see what Kevin has to say, and then I'll go over some verses in scripture that might be interesting to relate to our discussion. Hello, Kevin. Yeah. So I mentioned quite a bit, and let me know what you think. What are your thoughts so far? Well, well. Uh huh. Uh huh. So I think that we should be careful what we. I think saying Christian perspectives, I think there's so many denominations of Christianity with many different points of view. To give you an idea of where that rabbit hole goes, because we should really think about principles in the philosophical sense and the spiritual sense of, like, okay, well, based on what we can learn from what we look at how the disciples are portrayed as compared to how Jesus was portrayed, right? Like, to me, like, if we look at the biblical context, in even in an open-minded manner, right? Because I don't want to generalize how like, for instance, how you perceive, or how I perceive interpretation from reading the same Bible verses, right? Like, if I pick out like some arbitrary Bible verse, and I bring it up, and I say, okay, well, this is what it means to me, and this is what I get from it. It might mean something else to you, right? So, and you can have your own perspective. You can deem your own Christian perspective based on what you think. But that's, I think there's sort of like with each. It's not just Christianity, because it's Christianity has this interesting cultural dynamism to it, that you have all these different denominations. So I just want to say, I don't want to go on another tangent, but I just want to point out that I don't think there's a wrong. I don't want to. I want us to be careful about stereotyping. Okay, this is what somebody who's actually a Christian thinks, as opposed to somebody who's a skeptic or is secular. Or you can be a Christian and have mostly a secular leaning, or maybe the way you think politically and how people should treat one another is different based on how you interpret the principles that are portrayed as you interpret them. Right? It's like, if I look at the Ten Commandments as portrayed by Moses, right? If I go back all the way to the Old Testament, and people have different interpretations of that. But I just wanted to point that out. So there's no wrong way to approach it, I guess is what I'm saying. So feel free to, like, say what you gotta say about it, and then I'll provide my own perspective, and then I can relate, like, oh, here's a here's a verse that I think relates to that, and then we can look into that, and we can look in that, I'm largely looking at this from an open-ended angle myself. So I can't say from a more fundamentalist point of view, or certain tradition-based or denominational point of view about what's right or wrong. And I just think that, it's like, who am I to say, like, okay, like, this is what a Christian thinks. It's like this is what a Muslim thinks. This is what a Jew thinks about this. Like, it's like, let's think open-ended about it. Who cares? Like, if somebody's actually, somebody who's deeply committed to their faith in a certain way, like they're a Catholic, there's a certain denomination of Catholicism, and it's like, okay, but why is that important too? Okay, so what let's say I make a point based on, like, some denominational context. Like, I think it's even more important to bring about to make the point about, okay, well, why does this denominational why is this important from a Catholic point of view as opposed to a Protestant point of view, right? But anyway, just share what's on your mind. That's how I feel. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And oh yeah, I mentioned earlier, I have this interesting story that some Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on my door. I think it was last Wednesday. When was it? I think it was about. Was it last week? It was last week. Okay, well, recently, some Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on my door, and before that happened, right? This was like a little early in the day. I think it was about 11 o'clock at noon. And what happened was, so I do this. I've told you about this prayer ritual I have. I call it a prayer ritual now. Where I basically sit down. I sit in my bed, and I cry my eyes out for about 20 minutes or more. And as of recently, I've been listening to Christian music. I guess for the past 2.5 months, I've been largely listening to Christian music as I've been doing this. And I can really go. Maybe not this session. Maybe one of the next couple of sessions, I'll really go into my perspective of the dynamics of prayer and how I pray, and why crying my eyes out is my way of. Is my ritualistic approach to prayer, and how I go about that. Poetically, I've been telling people about how I shed tears for the Lord, so to speak. But so what happened was, it was like a little over 20 minutes, right? I was doing this prayer ritual, and it was around 11 o'clock, and then some Jehovah's Witnesses start knocking on my door, right? So it was quite interesting. And then they handed me a pamphlet right here, right? They handed me a pamphlet, and I guess I got a little mini. I got two of these. I got a brochure and a little pamphlet. There's an interest. There's this verse on the pamphlet, right? Very interesting verse right here on the pamphlet. It says, "Happy are those conscious of their spiritual need," and that's quoted as Matthew 5:3. So I think what's interesting about when we see the term conscience or conscious, thrown around a lot in scripture, and I think this it's just it's like so beautiful that it's right here, right? Like this little it's just it's such a short, simple sentence, right? This little piece of scripture, and it's so loaded with interpretation, right? And that gets back to how we humans as agents, like, we have this capacity, this metacognitive capacity to be aware of how we make decisions and how that has an impact on our environment around us, right? And it's not just, this verse that points to this capacity we as humans have to have an impact on our ecosystem. I'm so bad at remembering that word for word these different verses, but there's also a lot of different if we look at some of the stories of the disciples and their followers, like we remember when Kasny brought up what it means, like understanding what it means, this idea of companionship, how we coordinate with each other, right? The story of Job, which a lot of people interpret as, going through hardship, just this extent of overwhelming hardship just being constantly thrown at you, and how Job just was able to just keep carrying himself, having that groundedness to him, right? And a lot of people interpreted that story as where it's kind of like how we deal with going through the worst kind of, I don't want to call it suffering, but like all these just obstacles and stuff, these setbacks being thrown at us, and then we just come out of it. And that's very inspiring. But through that journey, Job was able to develop companionship, and his companionship was tested. He met people along the way. And how that had an impact on it, and how people engaged with him and helped him, like during his hardships. I don't know all the super intricate details of that story, but I think it's inspiring. So and that's one way we could take looking at that Matthew 5:3 passage, and then we can also talk about the story about Peter, which is a little later in Matthew, where the famous Jesus walking on water, and then approaches Peter in the boat, and Peter and Jesus asks Peter to reach out to him on the water, right? Everybody knows about the story, but I struggle with the details as much as a lot of other people do, but anyway, yeah, I thought it would be interesting to share about that story I had about my recent encounter with Jehovah's Witnesses. I thought it was interesting, and I got a couple interesting Bible verses here to get into. But anyway, and 2 days later, right, I was walking my dog. And I bumped into a priest walking out of his house on my way back from walking the dog, right? So that was also an interesting encounter that same week that I had that encounter with some Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm not sure if you, I guess we could sort of pivot a little bit here. I'm not sure if you had like an interesting spiritual encounter like that, or just something like that you would say was coincidental, perhaps, right? Like my story about the recent encounter with Jehovah's Witnesses, or what you think about it.
it's something you can't just search for directly, because everyone wants to be those, or at least says they want to be those, you know. So you cannot just directly search for it the way you can with like chess or, you know, surfing or something.
Yeah, yeah. I think I just realized that the audio output wasn't quite capturing, but I pretty much went on most of the time, so I think most of the audio was captured. But I just captured what you said right now. Um, but sorry. Continue. Was there was there like a key point you were trying to make there? I guess I got a little lost in your thoughts, but I didn't mean to interrupt there. But I just noticed because like as I noticed the recording, like I had to fix the output capture, but it might still show up in the recording, but that's why I was hoping to use Zoom tonight, but that's okay. It's capturing most of the audio, I would say. But anyway, there were some points that I wanted to go on, but I didn't know if there was like a couple more things you wanted to add, because I just noticed that like the last couple minutes of like what it caught, it just caught what you were like what you said in the recording, but I was a little confused because I was looking at the recording. But anyway, that's an off point. Hello?
I'm here.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking in the brochure that I got from the Jehovah's Witnesses, but before I get into that, I wasn't sure.
I think this is an example where there's this term virtue signaling, and it's used as a criticism that people will say these things. Oh, I like diversity or something, and in practice they don't necessarily hold them up. So it's a virtue signal, and people have been criticized for making them. And I think that's valid. I think a lot of things are viewed as positives to have in society. Like, would you want an employee that values diversity or one that hates diversity? What do you want to value? You want someone who's creative or one who's boring? You know, there's all these things, and there is a lot of truth. If you actually get these people together, you can make very strong social networks. They're very pleasant. They feel very safe, and so on. Meaning you're not going to be jumped on if you say something, and on the other hand, you're not going to have people harass you or stuff like that. This is very kind of peaceful and pleasant if you get these people together. The trouble is the virtue signaling kind of clouds up who actually thinks this way. So, same with spirituality. Like, it clouds up what religion someone doesn't really depend on how they are how spiritual they are. That's another R squared zero. It doesn't really depend. And I think that I think that to kind of get around this virtue signaling, one thing that's helped me is look for people. Is you kind of just think of the interactions you've had with people. And again, you're not using it to reject people, but you're using it to find people. So like if you meet someone briefly, what are the things they say? And just kind of a little bit of that, well, what actually are they saying, can then be used to go forward to find these. So like the ability to find people who say have a strong amount of spirituality, have a lot of interesting things to say about, have of an unusual perspective in a benign way, in a way that is just different. Those are people who are interesting, and to actually find them, you kind of have to look at what they say apart from a virtue signal. Go outside the virtue signal, look at what they say. How Googleable is what they say? How much critical thinking is there? That's a little harder to assess because that itself is a very soft, subjective term. It's not a very quantitative thing. But you could say, like, but there are certain things I look for. One is, do they have ideas that are not Googleable? Meaning ideas that I can't really Google the idea as is. I can usually Google the pieces, but, like, are they showing a lot of assembly, a lot of skill in assembling pieces into a meaningful idea? Another thing is, are they skeptical in a healthy way but not a dismissive way? So people who aren't going to have blind faith in ideas they hear, or their scriptures, because there's a lot more to being religious and having blind faith in whatever book you follow. The problem is the blind faith, not the faith, if that makes sense. So do they not have? Are they able to avoid blind faith in people, or like works that people made, and maybe even they're good at avoiding blind faith in their own ideas. They're good at questioning things on one hand, and then on the other hand, you want them to also be willing to engage. So if they just throw their hands up and say, I can't know anything, then they can't engage in, then it's kind of hard to have a conversation. Like if someone has blind faith in something, whether it be the Bible, the Quran, or atheism, or what someone says, or a politician, or whatever, you cannot really engage with them. You won't really learn anything from them, because generally they'll be kind of just spouting. They're like a mouthpiece of whatever they have blind faith in. So you might as well just read the original source kind of thing. That's bad. But they're super dismissive of learning anything metaphysical or religious or whatever. Then the conversations also die out. It's really that nice balance where you can be skeptical and open-minded, and it's something that's kind of hard to strike at an individual level, and you do your best. And then you also find people who are good at doing it, and I think it's one of those things that if people genuinely have it, it's wonderful to meet those people, who know those people. But it's just hard to find as a virtue signal. Diversity is really nice when you value it. But what does that actually mean? It doesn't just mean like checking boxes or saying you value it. It means they encounter something different, something unusual, and they are willing to engage with it because they don't jump to the conclusion that their way is better than this other way.
Mm-hmm.
And those all make a very valuable person. And that could be culture, a race, or whatever, but it could also be just someone with different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
That's where neurodivergence kind of becomes relevant. So that's kind of my overall strategy for finding interesting people. I would say, you look at how the conversations go, you look at various things. You have to be careful about people who just yes you and don't have much depth to it. It doesn't mean they're bad people, but they could just be trying to hold conversation. You want to see someone who engages with depth, who has an understanding of it, because that means they genuinely care and are interested, and not just like running some subroutine to sound likable. Yeah, it's a difficult thing to find people. Discord has so many Discord servers, all little niche interests, stuff like that. Such a huge place. And then that's step one. And then now you have to think of who is on the server. Of course, there's other platforms just like Discord and so on. It's very complex.
Yeah, when you mention blind faith, I think what immediately certainly comes to mind is, I'm sure you're familiar with Pascal's wager, right? And for those of you who aren't familiar with Pascal's wager, it's the argument that people are, and this is from Google. I'm gonna just quote Google because I think Google provides a pretty good description of Pascal's wager. It says Pascal's wager is a philosophical argument that people are essentially gambling with their lives when deciding whether or not to believe in God. So, of course, I feel like this isn't a good argument. I don't I would say, in the instance where my strong point towards saying that this is not a good argument would have to be based off my own first principles way of deriving my own reasoning for faith and what God means to me, which goes back to teleology and talking about agent-based interactions and how we're all agents and how we're trying to optimize each other's agency, or how God really, to me, and again, we can go back to biblical scripture to connect this. I guess for most people, the way this connects is not in the standard or traditional sense of like what God means, what does it mean to have faith, which I would say is more uh, uh, is more in line with what you call blind faith. It's like, okay, how can I know that God exists or not? It's okay. Well, I think the problem here is dealing with fuzzy definitions of God in the first place, right? If we come up with a first principles means to uh, come up with certain aspects that relate to what God means. And if we look at Scripture, we talk about how God, me generalizing, saying God is goodness, God is the capacity for goodness, which is not necessarily wrong. But if we go back to Scripture, and even if we go towards, to the Old Testament, like closer to the beginning, and not necessarily just the Genesis story per se, but thinking about, going back to Moses and the commandments. When we're thinking about ethics, we're thinking about, how do we all get along. And we're all in this ecosystem. Like, for better or worse, our actions in this collective sense of how we're interacting, for better or worse, right? Like whether we're fighting with each other, where we're violently coordinating with each other, or we're getting along with each other, where we have this diplomatic way of
Because
engaging with each other. But that's the way I make sense of what God means to me and what it means to have
I
faith.
guess think of divinity as unfalsifiable and forces of creation at metaphysical level. But that brings to the discussion on what I'm I'm kind of curious how common this is, but small God interpretations of
Yes.
the Bible
Yeah.
and Christianity. I mean, I'm curious about all myth,
Can,
mythos, bodies of mythology, because there's this idea in my head that is
can you get more into what
it's this
small
idea I
God
have.
means, though? Like, I know you brought that
Yeah,
up,
so
but yeah.
I have this idea in my head. Um, there's there is of course overwhelming evidence for evolution as
Mm-hmm.
scientific truth. So long as people realize that evolution isn't asking the question, if you were to travel back in time, what would you see? No, it's asking the question, what story is consistent with what we see today? No one's actually traveling back in time. It's impossible to travel back in time as far as we know. Like, it's either completely impossible or it's very far away. So when people have all these vivid descriptions, with sauropods tower over humans and so on, and T-Rexes, what you have to remember is that, those vivid descriptions are not at all, they're not at all the scientific evidence itself. It's an artist's impression. It's heavily processed. Because what people see today is not that. They see colorless, basically gray fossils, which is rock, in certain shapes. They don't even have DNA, and we see living creatures today, so we can guess what dinosaurs look like because some are alive today, so that gives us clues. Okay, they're going to have feathers most likely, and many do, but it's harder to fossilize it.
Mm-hmm.
So scientific truth is evolution is consistent with what we see today. When you talk about if you were to go back in time, which is impossible to assess scientifically, either completely impossible or at least in the foreseeable future, you're not talking about scientific truth anymore, because you're talking about something cannot be scientifically addressed. You can't actually go back in time. It's an impossible experiment. You can't test the hypothesis that if I go back in time I see something, because you can't do that. You can test hypotheses about fossils. Well, based on how evolution works, I would expect that the fossils in this area that was flooded for a while are going to have more streamlining because they were aquatic or something. You can scientifically test inference like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what people kind of forget when they teach evolution, is that it's if you really limited the scientific testability, you never ask the question, if you were to go back in time, what would you say? That's just a useful, convenient tool to teach it. Well, that's like quantum collapse. It's not something that's been observed, but something. So now, sorry to ramble, but
that's all right.
Now the question is it possible to have evolution and creation both in full force instead of a messy compromise with intelligent design? I'm talking both in full force, where science will not give any evidence of intelligence.
So
yet the world was actually created recently-ish,
Right.
And the answer is, yeah, yes, you can. Yes. Are you saying something?
Yeah, I wanted to say something, but I think that I'm not the one. I'm not. I would say that intelligent design is a faulty modeling from the especially. I think it's an outdated interpretation of what we consider to be the biblical interpretation, or like how, or what can provide a strong apologetic stance from the theological point of view. And okay, then we have to get back to first principles again of, okay, well, if creationism and intelligent design doesn't make sense, how do we, what do we do to reframe the biblical interpretation? And then people who are not Christians, that they have their own intelligent design apologetics lined up for their interpretation, in according to their scripture.
Okay, so I'm not going to talk about.
But I want.
I don't.
No, it's okay. So certain things I want to say is we want. I think it's appropriate to reframe creation in terms of generative processes. If we reframe the creationist argument to be in line with evolution, where we consider, okay, this whole creationist perspective, it's not in line scientifically, like as you're saying. But if we go with the generative, framework, with like, okay, we have these emergent capacities of interactions that are happening in the universe, and with the evolutionary constraints of life itself, how different organisms evolve over time. If we consider that to be a generative unfolding process, then we can reframe the intelligent design argument entirely and just say intelligence is an emergent generative process, right? You see where I'm going with that? That's my main critique is, and I think what made the intelligent design argument popular. Are you familiar with William Lane Craig? Are you familiar with that name? Bill Craig, the Kalam argument, the Kalam. Yeah, I think that's what it's called. The Kalam argument. That's pretty much, basically saying that, the universe is finely tuned for intelligent design and all that stuff, right? That's what you mean by creationism, right? In the intelligent design argument, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. So
Yeah. So that's Bill Craig's Kalam argument. Yeah. But yeah, go on. I just figured I would say, you know what? If we just take creationism itself and reframe it with respect to generative processes and how that connects with evolution, then we're fixing that logical inconsistency that's in line with the biblical narrative, if that makes sense. And I could get more into that, but I'm curious what other comments you have to make.
yeah, I can just quickly explain it. We think of creationism as broadly people using their imagination, one or more persons using their imagination to shape reality and create reality in the first place from a point where reality didn't exist before. And detail reality, kind of like those fractal programs where you get a rough pass and then it makes more and more detailed images. If you can think of creationism as that, there is, if that's the definition of creationism, there's one form that's compatible with evolution, and it's called mature world creation. And if you look at the perspective of Christianity, and you see similar things in other mythoses around the world. So really, I treat this problem as I'm trying to study what, hundreds of different, read up a little bit about what hundreds of different ethnic groups traditionally believed, thousands of years ago, just to get a sense of these archetypes. But it's a small. The mature world, basically, God created the world with the appearance of it. Now, this is where the big God and small God start. This is one place where big God starts. Small God starts to make a lot of difference. Christianity is traditionally a big God religion, but it could be made. You could have small God interpretations of it, and the mature world under a big God, you kind of get stuck. Meaning, like, okay, he controls every molecule. This big God's all powerful, omniscient. So he makes it perfectly resemble something older, and it's like including with memories and so on and tree brains. You just get stuck, there. It's not really interesting. It's like what you can do with them. But things are very different in the small God, mature world. So the way the small God and mature world creation goes is that initially someone imagined a world, like an author. They may have been in some other world or disembodied consciousness, not clear to the extent that this is a possibility versus just Big Bang, standard Big Bang. So I'm guessing it would be like another world that isn't too different than our own, and they were an author, creative person. Now remember, in the small God, being this divine force of creation is accessible to any intelligent entity. Maybe they're above average in creativity, but they wouldn't be like, it's not the big God where there's this fundamental uncrossable gap between God and the human. And small God is, maybe there's different degrees of creativity and consciousness and all this, but it's this just this small God. It's just not. It's not as black and white. It's not like, okay, God controls every single atom. So under the small God, that's how the universe came to be. Initially, someone envisioned Earth, most likely Earth, just like a world or a lab. Then they, think this happens all the time today with fiction. They develop characters. Then there's something, again, happens all the time today in fiction writing circles. Characters start to write themselves. And initially, the world is at a low realism level. It's not very detailed. This is someone's imagination. But once the characters start writing themselves, they can start to contribute to the creating of the world. And they can make characters of their own. And this becomes this metaphysical thing that extends beyond like the limits of computation of the human brain or something. Because there's this metaphysical thing that goes beyond just physics as we know it. That's the crux of the belief. So then they create more, and then they start to sculpt the world, and it grows in detail, and eventually, as it becomes more and more detailed, it becomes very consistent with the rules, and you lose the ability, gradually, slowly but surely, lose the ability to just will something into existence. So if someone's like, well, picture a mountain, now make the mountain a volcano. No, now make it an earthquake ridge. That's like at the very lowest world realism. I call it world realism. I call it, and they can just on a whim envision things. But it's not a very detailed world. It's kind of like a low resolution computer graphic or something. And that process where you let characters write themselves and then they start to create things and then that goes and snowballs is a small God creation. Now you could say, well, where does evolution come in? Remember that paleontologists are conscious, aren't they? So they want to. So there was a drive to, create the past of the world. Say, I was to ask the question, how does the world come to be? And that very act, and in the small God creation, if that part of the world has not yet been fleshed out, it can kind of fill it in. Oh, there's this fossil record, there's this transition over time. That makes sense. We came from simpler things and molecules started to react. It all kind of fills in and makes sense just because the world has to make sense. And science is very good at finding things that don't make sense, tearing them apart and making a theory that makes sense underneath it. All these paradoxes go away, like relativity. It's a good example. All these paradoxes. Oh no, but then it actually does this.
Sure.
So I call this the malleable world or the small God mature world. And you see this in mythologies all over. You have these people like the Native American myth. A few hours of driving from here to Yosemite. You have these people talk about creative, being creative. Or no, not being creative. They just talk about like people got into an argument and someone threw a basket and it became basket dome. And that's saying that back in time that could happen. The world was less detailed, so emotions and willpower could just make a mountain. Nowadays it's too detailed, so we have to kind of just work within the rules of the world more. Okay, now that's a gradually increasing resolution, and it seems like our world is creating worlds of its own. Just go to any science fiction writer group or fantasy novel writer, and you see that they talk about their own worlds and the characters that write themselves, and they're fleshing it out, and they're just kind of getting that process started. Of course, those worlds are much younger than Earth, so they're going to be less detailed. So because of the small gods, are limited, they can't just make every molecule. The process of creating a world is a process of increasing the detail, where if you were to live through that, you would initially be this, person that even the existence of yourself would be kind of this shaky thing. But you'd see a world where people could willpower other character. You would be a character that's writing himself, and you'd see a world where people could will these things, and you could interact with people almost like telepathically and so on. And then as time goes on, the world would become more and more detailed, and so on. And it would, the laws of physics would be kind of locked in place. Any magic given in the world would just be another law of physics. Electromagnetism is a good example. They invented this amazing system of magic. Oh, we just call it physics, and so just get more real. There'd be less flux, you could say. Paranormal phenomenon would become rarer and rarer, and eventually just be pushed to the margins. One more thing about this: there's this Bible verse, and I think there's similar things in other mythos. That says that everything's sustained through God. The small God version of this is kind of interesting. The big God version, again, it's like, well, God controls every molecule, sustains every single square cubic Planck length in the universe. It's kind of like, well, now what? It's kind of, with small gods, it becomes interesting because the small gods are limited, so they can only sustain, the world's only sustained through the collective, all the different consciousnesses that are in the world, and bound to smart animals generally. And if you go away from that enough, you kind of go analogous to a video game, like going away from the main world. It would lose detail, but in this example, it would become a place you could start to get more control over the details, but it'd be very difficult to get that far away. Now there is something, in terms of physical places, but when we have powerful computers, we're trying to put all this complex unconscious behavior, all this complex unconscious, not self-aware behavior out of our sustainability circle, or you could say, under the small god. Forget what that is. So then it's like, well, is it going to start to break down? And I feel some computer bugs can be this way, or it just doesn't make any sense until you consciously look at it and force it, lock it down. But that's interesting, is how much stuff with classical computers, and I believe that's not going to be sentient because it has to be quantum. How much can we put outside of and distant from conscious experience, and not hit these limitations of just we're sustaining area, each conscious being sustains an area around it to a certain degree of realism. And if we're trying to build something that's further away from our experience and very detailed, and then we prove it's detailed, oh, well, it can do this thing, I guess it's almost like we're going to hit some sort of limit there, where software complexity will have this limit, and we can't do that. And the reason why is because of this metaphysical small god sustaining that Bible verse applied to small gods, you could say. And then that's going to frustrate a lot of computer programmers. That's not going to be fun for me, because I program.
Yeah,
and a lot of programmers are going to get sad about that. It's what why isn't the software working? Well, because it's too complex and it's too far away from consciousness. Maybe they'll make it conscious somehow, but that sounds like that needs quantum.
Yeah, if I may add, so from the teleological angle, maybe that that like I'm trying to think about like what's gonna easily like how can I relate the small God to big God uh, conceptualization. So so I see two potential camps here, and the first camp, I think this is the more traditional camp, is that God, we when we talk about like when we try and imagine what God means, God, people will say, well, God is responsible for all that exists, right? So God is like this meta ontology or an ontology of ontologies, right? Like the compositional nature of being that is responsible for the compositional nature of being of its compositional nature, which, uh, it, like for me, I don't quite buy that, but and I feel like that maybe what you're relating to as big God argument is that like there's this all encompassing omniscientness and I could go into I did elaborate in a sense what omniscience means
I am
to
skeptical of
me.
the big God because the idea that something could be conscious entity, but is so fundamentally above our level that they could be
Mhm.
consciously aware of every single molecule in the universe at once. It just seems like that.
Like what does it mean to be an ontology of ontologies, right?
It
Like
just
that's
seems,
like
yeah, it
the
seems like that's
trickiness,
like
right?
asking for a set of all sets.
Uh-huh.
Russell's
And you
paradox.
don't
Like,
quite get that,
if
right?
they're so consciously aware of everything, they're aware of other conscious systems. Wouldn't the other conscious systems just be the conscious systems? And also, it kind of goes against the reality that we see. Authors create their worlds. The characters start writing themselves. It really shows. It really, if you believe in metaphysics, it really suggests that that's how a world gets created. Characters write themselves, then they can start participating in the work of creation. Kind of like raising a family and having to help out in the farm work, and then you can do more work total, and just can snowball out.
Uh-huh.
And other evidence for creation are certain small things like the eclipse coincidence and so on, but
Mhm.
really the big evidence is that very small amount, very little sunlight is captured. The energy in the sunlight is captured into the brains of smart animals, very small.
Mhm.
How many orders of magnitude inefficient is the universe at being it creating consciousness?
Okay,
Now that
well,
sounds like we're
right. Yeah.
it, and in a constantly infinitely growing tree of universes and conscious entities creating their own world becomes real, and that goes on and on and on forever, on and on forever. This isn't really a problem, but in a world where we kind of just have this universe and we expect eventually a super civilization of Dyson spheres or even more exotic forms of
Mhm.
create, it's like, well, we're just freakishly early in terms of the conscious population. This seems like an incredible coincidence. Why are we here so early when 0.00001% of the sun's energy is caught? Why aren't we in a situation where, you know, most of the sun's energy is used to sustain consciousness? Instead of some ridiculously, with Dyson spheres, instead of some ridiculously small, or at least a lot more.
Mhm.
Like even if you just look at sunlight hitting Earth, it's a tiny fraction. So yeah, I think that, that's kind of it just feels like from the metaphysical point of view when I talk about consciousness, it just feels very natural. And if you look at pagan myths all over the world, it's kind of what you see like a time and place where the world was more malleable in the sense that someone could get angry, throw something, and harvest it. a furrow out, or someone could get stuck in the mud and turn into a giant tree or something. These creation myths around the world are very interesting. They're very kind of small god-esque, and if you have ordinary people that aren't described as like special, or at least not to the same degree that the traditional interpretation of Christianity is described, and then like the world just kind of can bend to people's will, and that's because that's how worlds behaved early on in creation. But now ours is much more detailed and set in stone,
Mm-hmm.
and we just have to modify the world through the laws of physics and so on that it gave us.
Yeah,
So yeah, that's kind of it's an interesting thing, and it's not something that goes against science. It's something that aligns with the I call it the inefficient consciousness problem. And it's something that seems to align with pagan myths from all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that seems to align with what authors say when they create worlds of their own.
Okay.
Is that they're creating characters that write themselves. That suggests they're creating more consciousness in their brain. But then there doesn't seem to be a limit to this. It's like they can create such a huge world. And then the consciousnesses can go out into that world and they're not stuck, in front, so to speak, being right, like, on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So it just seems like a natural process. Now, it doesn't mean it's true. So, there's speculation. It's hard to hit, scientific. It's not really a scientific question at this point. It's talking about consciousness. I don't know. But yeah,
Yet there's a lot of points that I could
it
get
seems
into.
very it seems very obvious that like I've never encountered this belief system, or almost never. I either encounter atheism or big God
Mm-hmm.
generally.
So, first off, getting back to how do we tackle with creationism? Like, there's so many like different places to snowball with the points you brought up. And I want to go back to like how we think of reframing creationism as like thinking about generative processes and like the emergence of phenomena in, if we consider where we are in the cosmos, right? How we relate the biblical narrative to how life has happened in our place of the cosmos. And sure, it's still a mystery whether or not life exists anywhere else outside the cosmos, and there's a lot of things we could speculate on that. And I think that, and I looked up creation as mentioned in the Bible, like the different different interesting verses that we can look at, and I figured like, okay, well, I'm gonna mention some of these different verses, and then we can. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Gaia hypothesis, but we can connect a number of these verses to what the Gaia hypothesis proposes. So, for those of you who are unaware of what the Gaia hypothesis proposes, and again, a quick Google, I get a nice explanation from Google. So I'm gonna read it right off of Google, because I think it's just so nicely worded. It says the Gaia hypothesis, also known as the Gaia theory, is the idea that the Earth and its living organisms, and like I mentioned about organisms, we think about agents, work together to maintain conditions that support life on the planet. The Gaia hypothesis suggests that the Earth's biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and soil layer are closely linked and work together to regulate the planet's physical and chemical conditions. This self-regulating system uses negative feedback loops to keep the planet within a range of conditions that are favorable for life. The Gaia hypothesis differs from the traditional view of ecology, which sees ecology as a biological response to physical conditions. However, some evolutionary biologists have tended to ignore the Gaia hypothesis as they believe it's difficult to explain how a self-regulating biosphere could arise. Some say that the Gaia hypothesis is ill-defined, unfalsifiable, and unparsimonious. Others say that the Gaia concept is so flexible that it's difficult to find confirmatory examples. And the different verses I wanted to bring up, how there's a ton of them here. I'm just gonna bring up a handful that really catch my eye, starting from the top down. So in Romans chapter 1 verse 20, for his inevitable attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 through 31. And I'm not going to go through all the verses, but this is a really famous one, and this is going to sound familiar to you, but like you probably don't remember this word for word, but here it is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And it keeps going on and on and on. Let's go to a different one other than Genesis here. Okay, Psalm chapter 33 verse 6 says, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their hosts." So there's a lot I can get into here, but I think this just works really well with correlating to what the Gaia hypothesis denotes, because we have this whole, like, we're part of this whole ecosystem, right? And every agent in the ecosystem has a role to like stabilize the diversity of life, that the diversity of agency that exists within the ecosystem, right? So a lot of these creation-based verses really get into like linking, like connecting to the Gaia hypothesis, and I'm not sure if I spoke to you about the Gaia hypothesis, but I'm curious about.
I've heard of it. I've heard of days in the world and so on. It is kind of untestable, I guess you could say. Yeah, it's untestable. But I did want to say something about the big God versus small God. Is the big God versus small God is let me explain it. It is the big God interpretation of this Genesis is that they the big God interpretation of this Genesis that God is so powerful to do that. And a small God interpretation is that the world was so young that a person could do it. And the world was so dreamlike and ethereal that an ordinary person to put their mind to it. So, big God versus small God. It's a different interpretation. Like, how can someone bring life into it? And when I say the word was God, that suggests a creation by the author instead of a movie writer, but anyway, by an author written. Anyway, small God. So it's a different interpretation. Like, why can God create this? There's those are possible reasons. One is that God is so fundamentally above other conscious entities that he can do that and we can't. The other is that the world was so much younger back then because it was literally freshly being created that he could do that because and we can with our own worlds. We cannot with Earth because Earth's too old, it's too mature, things are too lofty, so there's too many conscious entities sustaining a shared reality. It's too you're not going to change it. And yeah, it's an example where I think you can go through most of the Bible and look at the small versus big God interpretations. The most common interpretations of big God. That's like the typical one you find. Well, he can do that because he's God, But the small God, the fact that used to be such a world-ranging belief system, and then it's like absent from anywhere today. Where has it gone? Maybe as a world become mature. I mean, if you saw small God miracles, if you lived in the world back when it was less set in stone, it would be maybe that kind of tends to make you believe in what you see, kind of thing. But if you see a world set in stone, well, how can someone create the world? Well, it has to be an amazing person. Well, maybe the world wasn't always set in stone. Maybe just an ordinary person can do that. So yeah, I think you can interpret a lot of any mythos or religious text or whatever under either the small or big God interpretation. I think they're flexible enough that you could kind of find inspiration there.
Yeah, I've put a lot of thought on, from an apologetic standpoint, on, okay, well, the intelligent design argument is problematic as proposed by William Lane Craig. And I guess some people might be familiar with he also goes by the name of Bill Craig. He very famous. He used to be a very famous Christian apologist. Not so famous anymore. I'm not quite sure why. I kind of try to look into what happened. There's just not much information out there. He hasn't been going around debating people for a while. So I guess the bigger names you see nowadays are Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau, Rowan Williams. So these are a couple big apologists that I think are a big deal, and I think their arguments should be taken seriously. But I think the amazing thing about a narrative is, like, we could take inspiration from even a science fiction story or any kind of story, right? And we can relate it to how we like the moments, each decision we make, each reflecting upon our actions, right? We can especially reflect upon the biblical narrative, right? And how when we look at what the disciples did and what the apostles did, and in the cheesy way we could make reference. Oh, what did Christ do? Like, how why did people praise him? Why did people condemn him? Right? And I think this is strongly cultural, and there's a lot of psychological depth here. right? Like this idea of how we could develop archetypes based on the characters and caricatures portrayed in the biblical context, right? So I would say it doesn't matter if, and for those people out there who are more traditional and are convinced that the biblical narrative is true, and that everything revealed in the biblical narrative actually happened historically, and I would say that it doesn't we don't have to convince ourselves it's true, and it doesn't have to be true. And the reasoning is because we can relate how we live our lives back to these stories and think openly of these stories, these narratives, and what lessons can we learn by cross-referencing how we interpret the biblical context to what we could say about how we're living our lives, or how different groups of people and different decisions are being made politically and economically and what have you. So I think there's a profound deepness of constructing these psychological archetypes based off like how we interpret different verses and different places of the Bible. I think it's important to recognize that, and that's why there is a denomination of atheists that are Christians, right? There's Christian atheists out there, right? There's a whole denomination of people out there, as ridiculous as that sounds, right? So Christianity has much more to do with the principles that we're inspired by, that reflects upon the biblical narrative. Now, I don't call myself an atheist. I will say I used to be an atheist, but my argument for my variation of theism is post-theism, right? That based on the perspective I take from agency and the active inference perspective as well, and coupling those together with process theory, I feel like there's a strong philosophically, theologically aligned position you can make about what God means, and perhaps it relates to your small god interpretation, because, like I said, there's logical. I feel like there's logical inconsistencies to say that there's an ontology of ontologies, but that there are relations between ontologies, between sets, right? It's not that there's a set that contains all sets, but there's relations of sets that contain bigger sets, right? So I think from there we can see that life, the dynamics of life, emerge into the universe, right? We go back to the anthropic principle point of view, and then we connect that with the Gaia hypothesis, and we say, well, the capacity for life to symbiotically sustain itself in an ecosystem, well, doesn't this relate to what God really means? Is like how we as agents ethically align align ourselves with, in terms of like what we care about and like how we appreciate each other's agency. Is this what God means then? Because if it can be demonstrated that we can take the biblical narrative pretty much entirely and argue for this, then who's to say that this isn't a plausible point of view, at least for a new age denomination of Christianity, or a different meta-modern approach to interpreting what Christian principles could propose because there's, like I said, there's many denominations, and I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to think about this. I'm just providing my own perspective, like you are, and I don't think there's a right or wrong way to say, okay, this is what it means to be a Christian. I have to follow certain things word for word, otherwise I'm cherry picking, right? But I think like the apologetic standpoint of cherry picking as postulated from the secular point of view is sort of like a double standard, right? Because if how we interpret the Bible is really personal and interpersonal, and there's no right or wrong way to interpret the narrative, then like, okay, how am I cherry picking, right? Because if there's, even if there is a more consensus aligned way of interpreting different verses of the Bible, it still comes back to how we consider moral alignment, this ethical policy alignment of agents, and how we appreciate each other's agency. So that's the way I look at it. But I feel like the more traditionalist perspective is to consider an ontology of ontologies, that some being, like would generalize, some being created the universe, right? Which I think is kind of silly, right? So I think if we go back to Genesis, chapter 1, with between verses 1 and 31, right? What was mentioned there was, I'm not going to recite the whole verse. I'm just going to pick out one verse that really, really, really caught my eye here. The earth was without form and void, and the darkness was over the face of the deep. So like, this gets me thinking about, okay, does the universe have a specific form that we can make sense of, right? Because like we can we can make certain postulations from physics about the electromagnetic force as a toroidal, of having toroidal dimensionality for how the electromagnetic field interactions propagate in space-time, right? You have a toroidal field, right? You can think of a donut shape. Like it's like a extreme generalization of what I'm saying is, imagine a donut, right? And like the donut is showing how the different ways the electromagnetic field interacts with each other in its vicinity of space, right? And you can interpolate how, right? Obviously, you can interpolate the generalization of how the field potential propagates, right? Based on how you construct circuits and all that different stuff, right? So, but anyway, what was the point I was going to make, right? It's like this idea of like thinking about form, like how we, like, what is a form? What is it, like, how do we generalize interactions or behavior, or how space is taken up over time in the universe? Like, how does matter, how is the fabric of space-time taken up by matter, right? And the interactions that happen with, like, and like what's happening as the universe is expanding, right? It's increasingly expanding, right? Like, we know that the universe is increasingly expanding. So what form does this expansion yield, right? Of the universe, right? So I think it's even ever more interesting how we can relate what's going on with Genesis. Like, if we go back to talk about Genesis, now we can talk about the expansion rate of the universe, and thinking about like the beginning of the universe. Was there a beginning of the universe? Which I'm not going to get into that, but even though my perspective on it is there wasn't a beginning of the universe. But anyway, I just think that even though the traditionalist sense of thinking about God is like thinking about ontology of ontologies, I think it's perfect. I'm not saying it's wrong to necessarily have that point of view, but I really think that people should think about it, right? And be like, okay, what is an ontology of ontologies? And if I can logically make sense of that. Like for me personally, it doesn't make sense. So that's why I go with the teleological perspective of God, right? Because if you have like a whole symbiotic cohesiveness of agents interacting with each other, where agents somehow spontaneously emerged into existence, and we can call that creation, right? Like the spontaneous emergence of agency, of life happening. So, I mean, I think it's fine to take that perspective and then relate that back to the biblical narrative. You know, I am curious about like how people can make sense of this ontology of ontologies perspective, and you know, I think some of these big Christian apologists they do believe in this ontology of ontologies perspective, but I think the way to make sense of that is that you assume you have a set that contains all sets, right? So you're familiar with Stephen Wolfram, right? If I have a rule, if I have a whole rule space, I have the rule. The first rule is that, okay, well, I have a sandbox, right? That I can construct a rule. The first rule is I have a capacity to construct a rule that is bounded within the space of interactions where I have rules that condone like what can happen within the space. So like I have some interactions of things, and I have rules for those things to interact with each other, right? Of course, I'm generalizing Wolfram's notion of a rule space, or what is also known as the Ruliad. But I guess like what I find challenging is like you have to consider, okay, well, if I have a set that contains everything, does that set also contain nothing? Right? Because that kind of conflates the conception that I have a space that contains, I have a set of everything, but which also contains nothing. So that's one way to I suppose throw a wrench at that. But also like the fact that it's hard to if the space itself is not fit, if the set is not fixed, right? That there's more that can be. The set can just kind of expand and contain more things, right? So then is it a set that contains all sets, or that does the set just grow and develop itself to contain more? You know, there somehow the set develops more associations over time, right? So that's also interesting. I guess you could say you have a loose ontology, but at some point you have to consider, okay, well, is emergence itself God, right? Is the capacity of emergence God, where it's like, okay, like the scaling of interactions is that what we're going to call God? But then, you know, that's very broad. You know, my argument, like my main criticism on that is like, okay, we don't want God to be too broad. Like, if God is responsible for everything, then that's too broad for me, because that's like saying God is the emergence factor, right? God is the scaling factor of the emergence, right? Somehow the universe emerged, or was it here the whole time, right? So you see, like, you kind of like, it's like, okay, well, if the universe emerged, then that means there was a beginning. But wait a minute, if maybe there wasn't a beginning of the universe, right? So then you have another problem there, right? Because you can't prove that there was a beginning. You can't prove that there's going to be an end of the universe, right? So there's like I feel like you have this like little back and forth of coming up with arguments to demonstrate, well, I can have an ontology of ontologies, and then it's like, oh, wait a minute, no, I can't have an ontology of ontologies because I haven't thought about this problem, right? So, I'm not sure if you thought about that, but it's like okay, it's like, like, how do I deal with an ontology of ontologies? Well, okay, like, maybe that doesn't matter, so let's just talk about, like, the spontaneity of emergence, and, like, that God has to do with life itself, and life sustaining itself, in a way that it appreciates itself, right? So, like, the diversity of life appreciates itself, and that's God. But yeah. So anyway, not to go on any more of a tangent. I know we're pretty elongated on time here, so I don't know how much more time you have, and I'm gonna have to get going soon because I think I have to help my mom with something. But yeah, let me know what
Yeah,
you think.
It was an interesting discussion. It just seems like the yes, it's hard to get my hands, hard to get your mind around, I guess you could say. Um, but the as I was going to say, the small God belief systems, yeah, they just are rare these days. It's hard to imagine the inefficiency that consciousness. Not using Dyson spheres, I would get a lot more conscious entities.
Yeah, I think that it really boils down to recognizing that we can really appreciate the apologetics beyond Pascal's wager, right? Because I think that Pascal's, like, when you brought up blind faith, right? And that's, again, like, it's dealing with the fuzziness of like, okay, what is God, right? And that's what had me wrestling with faith for a while, and what God meant, and for a while, like, I was probably on the most extreme end of the secular uh, uh, point of view, where it's like, okay, well, at first, like, I didn't really understand, like, how people were approaching me about God, and then I watched all these debates about, all the, like, the atheists, and then you have the apologists, like arguing for and against God, right? And and then for me, it's like, okay, well, the whole debating doesn't matter, and I got to a point where it's like, okay, like, I'm gonna make the assumption that God exists, right? And it's not gonna be based on blind faith. It's gonna be based on strong philosophical and logical first principle underpinnings, coupled with insights from the scientific process. I don't want to say that my own perspective is scientific, because, I always like to quote what Jeff Beck says science actually is, which is prediction and data compression. And data compression has to do with, okay, how can we find patterns of complicated behavior and reduce those patterns to more simplified explanations and models of that behavior, right? And how, like, that changes into more complicated behavior. So we have the compression aspect, and the prediction aspect is, okay, well, like, how can we understand different phenomena and navigate uncertainty, Like, how can we understand how to utilize the resources around us by learning more about their phenomenal capacities, in terms of like how we can leverage resources, use them as tools, and like how that got us to human society, right? How that got us to modern technology, the capacity for telecommunication, all these different modern advances that we take for granted, right? That we're so appreciative of. I think that I don't want to say it's wrong to have blind faith, but I think we should challenge the blind spots of our faith. For those of us who are really faith driven, or even people who are secular, right? I think it's important to challenge what we imagine, think logically and deeply about the associations we form in our heads and the decisions we make and how those interrelate with each other. And even for those, a lot of people on the extreme end of the secular side or secular point of view, which that they think, oh, thinking about God is ridiculous, talking about the Bible is ridiculous. But I think it's important to approach it with an open mind. And I don't mean to say that in the cheesy sense. It's like, okay, fine, be secular, be what you want to be, but let's understand, why does religion have importance in people's lives, right? And I think the most intuitive, logical explanation for that, which sounds cheesy, and I think this is the best explanation that apologists tend to make, is that it's like, hey, like, how do we think about our actions and our agency and appreciate each other in the world around us, right? How do we work together effectively and appreciate the agency we have? And to me, that's what the dynamics of of what I call the sacred, or having faith, is all about. And then the capacity for us to mutually be symbiotically most cohesive and appreciate each other's agency. That's what God is. And I could quote scripture, like one Bible verse after another to make my argument for that, right? I've gone through a number of Bible verses last session, but and I actually covered a couple today. The one from Matthew. Actually, I thought I covered this one. So in this Jehovah's Witness brochure, right? I think this was going to be a great closing Bible verse, and this is Isaiah chapter 65, verses 21 through 23. So that's in short form, that's Isaiah 65, 21-23. It says, "They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. No longer will they build houses and others live in them, or plant and others eat. For as the days of a tree, so will be the days of my people. My chosen ones will long enjoy the work of their hands. They will not labor in vain, nor will they bear children doomed to misfortune. For they will be a people blessed by the Lord, they and their descendants with them." So I think that's such a beautiful, I think that's such a beautiful poetic verse that kind of ties in like just how strong, how strong it can be, like this passionate manifestation of like, what does it mean for us to appreciate each other's agency and work together for better rather than worse. Like to understand like what our combined efforts of working together can bring us to, rather than hostility, right? And I think that's important. And we're over 2 hours into having this dialogue, and I appreciate you jumping on with me. I was hoping we'd have a few more people. I guess not, but I appreciate you jumping on. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to share that you had in mind, but I appreciate it.
I think I'm done for now.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, and thanks for those watching this at home. And until next time, thank you, and have a nice day, evening, whatever time of the day you're watching this, and
Okay.
yeah.